Senator, when you reintroduced this legislation, you called gun violence a public health crisis. Can you explain why you categorize it that way?
Well, it's one of the largest causes of death in the United States. It's much higher than other countries, and it's related to this gun culture which we have, and it's time for us to finally come to grips with the reality that we need to put in place really strong preventative measures. You know, 1/4, for example, of all suicides in America are veterans every year. 25% of all suicides. And as we know, guns are the principal means by which people do commit suicide in the United States. Having comprehensive studies on all of these issues will help us to put in place measures that can reduce those numbers dramatically. So that's all I'm really calling for. And if people are afraid of the research, they're afraid of what the consequences would be in terms of those preventative measures to reduce the incidence of those tragedies ever having to occur.
Senator, according to the Gun Violence Archive, there have been 141 mass shootings this year to date. Right now, we are not live, so that number could increase by the time our conversation is posted. This is a problem that affects every single community in the United States. Do you think this legislation is enough to stop the mass shooting cycle?
It's not enough, but it's an important step forward. Yes, I do support banning assault weapons. Yes, I do support comprehensive background checks. Yes, I do support further enhancement of red flag laws. But if we can't do that because of NRA control over the Republican Party, let's move over to where we can agree. And that is on research. For the last 3 years, we've been able to work with Republicans to now receive $100 million in funding for research. And my own belief is the more research findings are made public is the more likely we're able to pass these other meaningful measures as well in terms of restricting the types of guns and who has access to those guns in our society. We had a precedent last year that Senator Murphy and Senator Tillis, Democrat and Republican, were able to pass the first meaningful legislation in 25 years. It wasn't everything I would want, but it just does show that progress is possible, and I think this research is going to help to supercharge that development, but we have to get the funding to make it possible.
You mentioned that legislation, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Do you think that's as far as Republicans are willing to go when it comes to gun control legislation?
I think it was as far as we could go last year, but it was in response to tragedies across the country. And as you pointed out earlier, the number of mass shootings just continues to escalate. And my own belief is that the more that Americans can see these tragedies, see what's happening in schools all across the country, is the more they're going to put pressure on elected officials to put tougher safety measures on the books. So we had success last year. We went as far as we could. But I think it's quite telling that this movement is led by young people all across the country. Young people whose lives are permanently affected by the kinds of drills they have to go through in their grammar schools, in their kindergartens, in their high schools, in anticipation, unfortunately, of mass shooters arriving at the front doors of those schools. And I just think that the conscience of our country is going to respond to the political movement that's rising up from young people across our nation.
The Washington Post released something really interesting this week, that there have been 377 mass shootings, or school shootings rather, since Columbine. And you mentioned that this legislation also comes in response to things, and a criticism that lawmakers get is that loud calls for gun control legislation happens only immediately after a mass shooting, and outrage does tend to subside from the public view pretty soon after. I mean, an example of that is this week, the news cycle was totally swept up by Donald Trump's arraignment. Do you think that this is still a top priority for Democrats and Republicans alike?
Sadly, there will be another mass shooting, and that will once again command the headlines. even Donald Trump cannot replace a mass shooting in a school as the lead story in our country. That's how important it is to families. So while temporarily Donald Trump might once again get the headlines, the continuing story is going to be that of mass shootings, and unfortunately, so many of them in schools. And I do believe there's a movement that's building and led by young people and their parents, just demanding that there be stronger gun control in our country.